The moment Emily stepped into the house, a shiver traced her spine as if the walls themselves exhaled a warning. The nursery smelled faintly of lavender and something darker she couldn't name. Sophie sat in her crib, clutching a stuffed rabbit, eyes unnervingly wide, staring past Emily at the empty corner behind her. Shadows pooled where the soft nightlight failed to reach, and Emily felt the unmistakable prick of being watched. Her fingers brushed the camera she always carried, a strange compulsion urging her to set it up, to capture what her instincts screamed might be waiting. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the settling house felt amplified, as if some presence lingered just beyond the crib. Patient, silent, calculating. Emily placed her small nanny camera on the shelf, the lens gleaming under the dim nursery light. Every beep and click of the device sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet house. She crouched beside Sophie, whose curly blonde hair shimmered in the soft glow, and whispered playful encouragement to distract her own nerves. But as she straightened, Emily's eyes froze on the corner again. Shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, darker than before. The camera had picked it up, and she felt an invisible weight pressing at her chest. A chill crawled along her spine as if the house itself was exhaling in anticipation, waiting to be seen, waiting to move. Emily's phone trembled in her hand as she dialed Claire. Every click of the button sounded too loud, too deliberate. "I think there's something here," she whispered, voice cracking, but the line met her with calm dismissal. "It's probably just your imagination," Claire said, brushing off the unease she sensed in Emily. Yet the creaking of the floorboards, the soft thump of Sophie shifting in her crib, and the corner's unnerving darkness refused to be rationalized. Emily's fingers tightened around the phone, her breath shallow as a fleeting shadow darted behind the crib, moving impossibly fast for something that should not exist. Emily returned to the crib, heart hammering, and checked the camera feed. Her stomach churned as the live footage displayed something impossible. A tall, faceless figure just behind Sophie, unmoving yet unmistakably present. The crib's small wooden rails creaked as if responding to the unseen weight. Sophie babbled happily, oblivious, but the air seemed heavier, oppressive. Emily wanted to scream, to run, but her fascination chained her to the monitor. Every flicker of the shadow in the corner, every twitch of light across the walls felt deliberate, as if the entity was aware she was watching, inviting her closer into a trap she could not yet understand. Emily rewound the footage, stomach twisting as she paused on a frame that made her blood run cold. The shadow was no longer abstract. It had a shape, limbs slightly distorted, head tilted unnaturally. Every instinct screamed to delete the file, leave the house, forget everything. But her fingers trembled over the keyboard. The room around her seemed to breathe, the floorboards creaking in rhythm with her pounding heart. Sophie giggled softly, glancing at the corner as if sharing a secret Emily could not comprehend. And somewhere deep in the darkness behind the crib, the entity lingered, waiting for the next move. The next evening, Emily returned to babysit, her hands shaking as she set the camera at a higher angle. Sophie sat in her crib, eyes unnervingly bright, whispering to the corner as though speaking to an invisible companion. Emily tried to laugh it off, but the air felt thick, heavy with expectation. The shadows in the corner had grown bolder, stretching unnaturally toward the crib, dark tendrils brushing the floor. Every beep of the camera sounded like a warning, each flicker of the nightlight a heartbeat. Emily realized with dread that the footage from yesterday hadn't captured a fleeting anomaly. It had recorded intent. Something was alive there, waiting, patient, aware. Emily's stomach tightened as she reviewed the live feed. The figure moved with impossible fluidity, bending around corners, appearing closer to Sophie with each passing second. Sophie laughed softly, reaching toward the darkness as if it were a friend. Emily's rational mind screamed that this was impossible, but the camera proved otherwise. A faceless shape, its limbs elongating unnaturally, responding to Sophie's gestures. She felt an icy grip on her spine, a warning that observing had consequences. The house itself seemed to shiver, as if aware of her fear, the shadows twisting to study her in return. A sudden crash echoed from the crib as toys tumbled to the floor. Emily's heart leaped into her throat. Sophie giggled innocently, but the shadow had shifted, almost pressing against the crib bars. Emily backed away, desperate for rational explanation, but none existed. She grabbed the camera and leaned closer, realizing the lens captured details her eyes could not. The entity's faceless head tilting slowly, subtle flickers of movement in places impossible for a human to reach. The nursery was no longer a safe space. It had become a stage, and she was the unwilling audience. Emily's hands shook as she recorded continuously, hoping to catch definitive proof. The shadow seemed aware of her, responding to her every movement, stretching closer whenever she stepped forward. Sophie babbled as if narrating the entity's actions, words indecipherable but oddly precise. Emily felt her pulse spike as the temperature dropped, frost forming on the nightlight bulb, shadows warping unnaturally along the walls. She knew the camera was the only witness, and perhaps the only thing standing between Sophie and whatever lurked behind the crib. Emily's fingers hovered over the camera controls as she rewound the footage in disbelief. Each frame revealed more than she dared to see. Sophie's tiny hand grasping at thin air, shadows curling like living smoke. The entity's faceless head angling directly toward the lens. Her skin prickled with the awareness that they were being observed in return, that every heartbeat she felt was mirrored by something lurking beyond perception. And then a whisper, soft, low, unmistakable, echoed from the corner. A voice not belonging to any living thing calling Emily's name. She froze, trapped between disbelief and terror, knowing there was no turning back. Emily hadn't slept properly in days. Returning to the house felt like walking into a predator's lair. The air was colder, heavier, each step on the wooden floorboards echoing unnaturally. Sophie sat in her crib, humming softly, but her gaze was fixed on the shadow that had grown more defined. Limbs twitching, head tilting as if studying Emily. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet she remained, driven by a need for proof. The camera captured impossible movements. Shadows crawling along walls, subtle distortions of the nursery itself, as if the room bent and warped around the entity's presence. Emily realized the house was no longer just a home. It was a trap, and she had walked inside willingly. Emily tried to distract herself, moving toys, reading storybooks, speaking gently to Sophie. But every word felt hollow, every sound swallowed by the oppressive shadows. The entity mirrored her movements with subtle, horrifying precision. When she stepped forward, shadows twisted in response. Sophie whispered words she shouldn't know, calling the shadow by a name Emily didn't recognize. Emily's heart raced as she realized the entity responded only to certain people, and her presence alone was fueling its curiosity. Every flicker of light revealed subtle changes in the corner, shapes forming and dissolving. A silent predator calculating her next move. Emily's eyes widened as objects began to shift on their own. The mobile above the crib spun slowly, casting distorted shapes across the walls. Sophie reached for it, giggling, unaware of the unnatural force animating the room. Emily's fingers trembled as she realized the camera recorded movements she couldn't see with her own eyes. Walls rippling, shadows stretching impossibly, the faceless entity creeping closer whenever she looked away. Panic clawed at her chest. She wanted to scream, to escape, but the house seemed to constrict around her, holding her hostage in its growing darkness. Detective Harris arrived unexpectedly, his sharp hazel eyes scrutinizing Emily with suspicion. "Some things," he said quietly, voice low and urgent, "are better left unseen." Emily tried to explain, pointing toward the crib, toward the shadows, but he remained unmoved. A stern warning etched into every line of his face. The air thickened, shadows deepened, and Sophie's giggle seemed louder, more knowing. Emily's rational mind clashed violently with her fear, and she realized that confronting this entity without understanding it was dangerous. Yet she could not stop watching. The house had become a mirror, reflecting her deepest terror back at her. Emily stayed after the family left, driven by obsession. Cameras were placed around the nursery, recording everything, capturing subtle movements invisible to the naked eye. The shadows now seemed to anticipate her actions, curling around corners, whispering almost audibly, responding to her very thoughts. Sophie slept peacefully in the crib, innocent yet complicit, as if understanding the entity in ways Emily never could. Emily's reflection in the camera lens flickered with a shadow that was not her own, a faceless figure looming just behind her, its presence undeniable. She realized with cold clarity. She'd become part of the house's design, a puppet in a performance she could not control. Emily returned to the house under the guise of routine babysitting, but her mind raced with questions. She had begun to trace every subtle movement in the nursery, replaying footage frame by frame, noting how shadows bent and twisted impossibly. As she placed cameras in corners, the entity seemed to react, limbs curling closer to the lenses, head tilting to watch her. Sophie played quietly, humming to herself, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the corner, as if silently acknowledging the presence Emily feared. Each recording revealed phenomena that defied physics. Walls seemed to ripple, toys shifted on their own, and a faint whispering followed her movements. The house had become a living trap, and Emily was determined to uncover the truth. Emily rewound the footage obsessively, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Something was following patterns, reacting to her movements, almost intelligent in its intent. Sophie's babbling now seemed like communication, her tiny voice calling softly to the shadow. Emily froze as the entity's faceless head rotated slightly, aligning perfectly with the camera's lens. She whispered her own name into the quiet room, testing a theory, and the shadow leaned, just enough to prove it was aware, calculating, alive. Fear twisted with fascination. She was seeing the impossible and living to record it. Emily scoured the neighborhood library, discovering a pattern. Previous babysitters had reported unexplained phenomena in this house, their accounts dismissed as hysteria. Old newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, documented disappearances and odd incidents spanning decades. Each page she turned intensified her unease. This was not random. The entity was a repeating presence, and Sophie's home was merely the latest stage. The weight of inevitability pressed on her. This was larger than she could comprehend, but her compulsion to understand burned brighter than her fear. Back at the house, Emily set up her cameras with renewed precision, angling them to capture every corner. The shadows responded almost instantly, limbs stretching along walls, head tilting with disturbing awareness. Sophie played quietly, occasionally glancing at Emily as if guiding her through some invisible choreography. Emily reviewed the feed and froze. The footage revealed glimpses of movement she couldn't see in real time. Crib rails flexing subtly, shadows crawling along floors, the entity peering directly into each lens. It was intelligent, patient, and aware of the technology that sought to expose it. Detective Harris arrived once more, his expression sharp, almost warning. "You're digging where you shouldn't," he said quietly, his gaze flicking toward the shadows. Emily tried to explain the footage, the entity's awareness, Sophie's strange behavior, but he merely shook his head. Yet, even he could not ignore the subtle ripple in the air, the unnatural tilt of the entity's head, the way the shadows seemed to recoil and respond as Emily moved. Something ancient and calculating had been awakened, and Emily realized there might be no proof the authorities would ever acknowledge. Only her footage and the knowledge that it was still watching. Emily arrived alone that night, the house quiet yet alive with anticipation. Cameras lined every corner, but they felt useless against what awaited her. Sophie sat in her crib, humming softly, eyes bright with an unnatural awareness. The shadows shifted violently in the corners, crawling along the walls like living ink. Emily's hands trembled as she gripped the camera, her pulse hammering. Then, without warning, the entity emerged fully, towering behind the crib, faceless, limbs elongated and twitching with impossible motion. The air seemed to compress around Emily, her every breath stolen as the house itself watched. Emily's voice shook as she tried to command the entity, demanding it leave Sophie alone. But the shadow responded with subtle mockery, leaning closer, curling around the crib's rails. Sophie spoke in a soft, unnerving tone. Her words, indecipherable yet deliberate, seemingly instructing the entity. Emily realized the child had a connection to this being, a bond she could not understand. The room vibrated with a silent, oppressive energy. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet she stood frozen, locked in a terrifying standoff with a presence beyond comprehension. The entity surged forward suddenly, a ripple of darkness sweeping across the nursery. Emily lunged instinctively to shield Sophie, her scream echoing off warped walls. Sophie giggled in a voice far older than her years, reaching toward the entity as if greeting an old friend. Emily's camera captured every impossible detail, the entity's limbs elongating further, the crib rails bending under unseen pressure, shadows thickening and moving as if alive. Emily realized with terror that the entity responded to fear, feeding on her every heartbeat, every hesitation, every glance of terror. Emily felt the room collapse around her perception of reality. The air thickened, objects floated subtly, shadows twisted and writhed as if sentient. Sophie's laughter mingled with whispers, speaking secrets only the entity understood. Emily's eyes darted to the camera. Its feed captured movements her own eyes could not track, detailing the entity's unnatural mechanics. Every instinct screamed to escape, yet she could not move. Trapped in the nursery with the living nightmare, realizing the entity's power was far greater than she had imagined. The parents returned abruptly, too late to intervene. The shadow recoiled just enough to vanish into the corners, leaving a silence so oppressive it pressed against Emily's chest. Sophie sat innocently, unaware of the danger, yet the faint curl of a smile hinted she understood far more than she should. Emily slumped, exhausted, gripping the camera that had captured the unthinkable. She realized the entity revealed itself only to certain observers, feeding on fear while remaining elusive to others. The house was still alive, still waiting, and Emily's confrontation had merely confirmed the presence of something ancient, patient, and undeniably intelligent. The following day, Emily returned home, but the weight of the night pressed on her like stone. Her apartment felt alive with shadows, the whispering from the house following her in memory and imagination. She scrolled through the footage again, each frame revealing subtle details she had missed. The entity lingering behind Sophie's crib, the shadows curling unnaturally along walls, the faint trace of a face she had never noticed. Her pulse quickened with every playback. Though the house was now miles away, its presence lingered in her mind, feeding on her obsession, pulling her deeper into sleepless nights. Authorities arrived to confiscate Emily's cameras. Detective Harris, male, 50, graying hair, hazel eyes, stood silently as Emily protested, insisting the footage proved the entity's existence. His voice remained calm but firm. Some things are not meant to be revealed. Cameras, carefully set up to record every angle, were taken away, sealed, and removed from her possession. Emily felt a pang of helplessness. The evidence she had fought to capture was now locked away, leaving only memory and terror as proof of what had occurred. Even at home, Emily felt watched. The shadows seemed to gather in corners, subtle whispers threading through silence. Sophie remained untouched by the fear she had carried, her innocent demeanor masking an unsettling awareness. Emily's dreams were invaded nightly by faceless figures, the nursery twisting and bending in impossible ways. Reality itself felt unreliable, as if the entity had seeped beyond the house, attaching itself to her consciousness waiting for the next moment to manifest. Emily returned to the footage obsessively, seeking patterns the authorities had dismissed. Every replay revealed nuances she hadn't noticed. Shadows leaning, subtle shifts in Sophie's expressions, the entity's head tilting as if acknowledging her fear. Sleep eluded her. The lines between reality and memory blurred. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of light was now suspect. She understood that Sophie's connection to the entity was more than coincidence. The child seemed to be aware in ways Emily could not comprehend, a living bridge between two worlds. Emily realized with chilling clarity that the entity's influence had not ended with the seizure of cameras. The house, the shadows, Sophie's strange awareness, all of it lingered in her mind, tethering her to an unseen presence. Each night, whispers edged her consciousness, urging her to look, to record, to notice what others could not. She understood now that confrontation had not expelled the entity. It had only deepened the connection, and somewhere, just beyond perception, it waited, patient, intelligent, and eternal. Emily returned to the house one last time, a mix of desperation and dread tightening her chest. Cameras were positioned to capture every corner, every shadow, every twitch of Sophie's small body. The air was thicker than ever, pressing against her skin, heavy with anticipation. Sophie sat in the crib, humming softly, her eyes fixed on the empty corner that no longer seemed empty. The entity stirred, stretching its faceless form into the open just enough for Emily to glimpse impossible motion, limbs bending and elongating, head tilting unnaturally. Every instinct screamed to flee, but she stayed, heart pounding, camera rolling, ready for the final proof. The shadow surged forward, more defined than ever, filling the nursery with its dark presence. Sophie spoke clearly, her tiny voice echoing unnaturally, naming the entity in words Emily did not recognize. The camera captured every impossible movement. The crib rails flexing, shadows thickening, walls bending slightly, as if alive. Emily froze, realizing she could not protect the child, could not fully understand the connection, yet was powerless to look away. The entity existed beyond fear and reason, intelligent and patient. And for the first time, Emily understood that some horrors cannot be confronted. They can only be witnessed. Emily's vision blurred as the entity moved closer, stretching impossibly. Yet Sophie remained calm, almost guiding it. Whispers echoed from the corners, unintelligible but commanding. Emily raised her camera, capturing a frame that would haunt her forever. The entity, fully visible behind Sophie, its faceless head leaning toward her lens, limbs curling and stretching in impossible directions. The room vibrated with a low hum of power, and Emily realized that the house, the shadow, and the child were part of something ancient, something that had survived beyond the understanding of any human observer. Suddenly, Emily blacked out, her consciousness slipping into darkness. When she awoke, the nursery was empty. Sophie gone, the crib bare, and the house silent. Only the camera lay on the floor, recording. Emily's heart pounded as she picked it up, pressing play. The footage showed what she had feared. Sophie standing, speaking to the entity, shadows curling around her tiny form, the faceless figure tilting its head in acknowledgement before vanishing into thin air. Emily realized she had been an observer, powerless to intervene, witnessing something eternal that existed outside the laws of reality. Weeks later, the footage surfaced anonymously online. Emily watched from a distance, horrified as viewers collectively gasped at the entity fully revealed. Faceless, towering, intelligent, and patient. Sophie appeared serene, almost complicit, the faintest curl of a smile hinting at secrets Emily would never understand. And somewhere, beyond the screen, beyond the house, the entity waited, still observing, still patient, reminding all who saw it that some horrors are eternal, and some eyes are always watching.